You've probably seen the headlines, right? The U.S. and China trade relationship often sounds like some kind of high-stakes chess match. But what does that actually mean for markets, for businesses, and maybe most importantly, for your wallet? Today, we're doing a deep dive into this really intricate world of U.S.-China trade tariffs. We want to unravel the complex layers of duties, understand China's, strategic responses, and look at the real-world economic impacts right now, as of mid-2025. Our mission really is to cut through the jargon, the constant policy changes, and help you understand which tariff rates are actually in effect, and how they overlap, when they overlap, and what it all truly means. We'll even unpack that recent trade deal, which, well, depending on who you ask, might be more talk than action. So get ready for some surprising facts, maybe some aha moments. Okay, let's unpack this then. When we talk U.S.-China trade tariffs, it's definitely not just one simple number. It feels more like a tangled web, right? A multi-layered system that's gotten incredibly complex since 2018, and even more so since early 2025.
That's exactly right. And what's really fascinating, I think, is how these different measures overlap. We're dealing with what the sources call stacked duties, essentially, multiple different tariffs piled on top of each other. It makes the final cost pretty complex.
Stacked duties. Okay, so where do we even start with these layers?
Well, first, you've got the Section 301 tariffs. These were kind of the big opening move, the most sweeping China-specific tariffs, as they were called.
Yeah.
They started back in 2018. The stated reason was to counter what the U.S. saw as China's unfair trade practices. And they covered a huge amount of goods valued at U.S. $550 billion initially.
$550 billion, okay.
Yeah. And they didn't just stay static. There was a 4-year review wrapped up in September 2024 that led to significant new tariffs for 2025 and 2026.
New ones? Like what?
Big jumps. For example, tariffs on electric vehicles, EVs, they surged to a massive
100%.
Semiconductors went up to 50%, effective January 1st, 2025. And you're also seeing increases like 25% or higher on things like battery parts, medical gloves, natural graphite, permanent magnets, some of those kicking in this year, some in 2026.
So these aren't old news. They're actively evolving, targeting really specific strategic industries, it sounds like. Tech, manufacturing.
Precisely. Then, Layer 2, Section 232 tariffs. Now, these are different. They're framed around national security. They come under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, actually.
National security. Okay, how does that apply?
Well, tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from all countries, mind you, including China, were raised to 50% as of early June 2025.
50% on steel and aluminum.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting for everyday life. As of late June 2025, just recently, several common household appliances.
Like what?
Things that contain steel. Think combined refrigerator freezers, dryers, washing machines, dishwashers, cooking stoves. They're now subject to an additional 50% tariff.
Additional, on top of other tariffs.
Yes, but, and this is a key, it's levied on the proportion of steel in the product, not the whole item's value.
Oh, okay. So not the whole fridge price, just the value of the steel in the fridge gets that extra 50%. Still, that adds up.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
And under Section 232, automobiles and parts also saw a 25% tariff that started back in April 2025.
So yeah, if you're buying a new appliance or a car, chances are these national security tariffs are part of the price tag. That really brings it home.
Absolutely. And believe it or not, there are still more layers.
More. Okay.
Since early March 2025, there's been an additional 20% tariff slapped on most Chinese goods. These are explicitly aimed at addressing the illicit drug trade. They're sometimes called the fentanyl tariffs.
Right. I remember hearing about those. And then there were those headlines about the Liberation Day tariffs announced by President Trump. Where do they fit in this stack?
Good memory. Yes, those were announced in early April 2025. Started as a 34% duty on China, but things escalated quickly. Retaliatory actions pushed those rates way up, potentially as high as 125%, maybe even 145%.
Wow, that's incredibly high.
It was. However, there was a significant development in May 2025. Those specific high reciprocal tariffs were temporarily reduced down to 10%.
Temporarily?
Yes, for an initial 90-day period. We'll circle back to that deal later because it's complicated.
Okay, so we've got 301, 232, fentanyl tariffs, these reciprocal ones. Is there a base layer underneath all this?
Exactly. You always have the most favored nation, or MFN, tariffs. These are the sort of baseline rates.
Yeah.
For the U.S., it's generally around 3.3%. They apply broadly under WTO rules. And yes, they stack right on top of everything else we just talked about.
Okay. This is incredibly complex. With all these overlapping stacking duties, how do we even quantify the total impact? What's the bottom line average tariff rate the sources show?
It's a tough calculation, but the sources give us a number. As of May 2025, the average U.S. tariff on all Chinese imports stands at 51.1%.
51.1% average.
Average, which is, significantly higher than when Trump began his second term.
And how does that compare to what China charges on U.S. goods?
Well, China's average tariff on American goods is reported at 32.6%. So there's quite a gap there.
A significant gap indeed. Now, when the U.S. started imposing all these tariffs, China obviously didn't just sit back and watch. They hit back with their own duties, sure, but it seems like they also made some more strategic, maybe long-term shifts.
Indeed. China's response has really been multifaceted. On the one hand, yes, they mirrored U.S. actions. They imposed their own reciprocal tariffs, anti-dumping duties. Like, for instance, there's a 74.9% anti-dumping tariff on a specific U.S. plastic export, POM copolymer, that went into effect May 19, 2025. That's a material used in lots of things, electronics, cars.
So tit for tat on tariffs.
Yeah.
But what about other measures? Non-tariff stuff.
Right. They also use significant non-tariff barriers. One key example is adding some U.S. companies to an unreliable entities list.
What does that mean for those companies?
It effectively bars them from engaging in import-export activities or making new investments within China. It's a serious restriction. And perhaps, strategically, one of the most crucial moves was imposing export controls on 7 types of rare earth minerals.
Rare earths. Those are vital, right? For EVs, electronics, defense.
Absolutely vital. And China dominates the global production. So controlling their export is, well, it's a powerful lever to pull in this kind of dispute.
That's a major strategic play. I also remember hearing, though, about a really devastating impact on American farmers, specifically soybeans. Can you talk about that?
Yes, the soybean situation is a stark example of the real-world consequences. It's a critical part of global agriculture. U.S. soybean exports to China, which used to be a huge market, just plummeted from $12.3 billion in 2017 down to only $3.1 billion in 2018.
Just catastrophic for the farmers involved.
Absolutely. The estimates suggest American farmers lost around $24 billion from losing that market access. This led to, rising debts, even bankruptcies in some cases.
So how did China respond strategically beyond just tariffs, given that impact on soybeans?
Well, that shock really pushed China to prioritize, and the sources use this phrase, reducing its soybean dependence for its own food security.
Makes sense. What did they do?
Several things. They're actively working to increase their own domestic soybean production. They diversified where they buy from, turning heavily to Brazil, which is now their largest supplier.
Moving away from the U.S. as a source.
Exactly. And, interestingly, they significantly reduced the amount of soybean meal used in animal feed. The share dropped from nearly 18% in 2017 to about 15% in 2021. That saves millions of tons of soybeans annually.
Clever.
They've also accelerated the commercial planting of genetically modified GM soybeans to boost domestic yields. And they're even exploring really novel alternative protein sources, like they've apparently successfully synthesized protein from carbon monoxide in labs.
Synthesizing protein from COO. Wow. Okay, that shows a serious long-term strategic shift, not just a reaction. They're trying to reduce vulnerability.
Precisely. It's about long-term resilience.
Okay, so we've got the tariffs, the layers, China's responses. Let's talk about the impact here in the U.S. For you, the consumer, and the broader economy. These tariffs, even with some recent tweaks, they must have had real consequences.
Oh, absolutely. The data paints a pretty clear picture. First, just higher consumer prices. You, the consumer, are facing an overall average effective tariff rate of 17.8% as of May 2025.
17.8%. That sounds high historically.
It is. According to the sources, it's the highest average effective rate since 1934.
Since 1934. Wow.
And it's not just an abstract number. The estimated price level increase from all the 2025 tariffs is about 1.7% in the short run, which translates, the sources estimate, to an average loss per household of about $2,800 in 2024 dollars.
$2,800 per household. That's the real aha moment, isn't it? That's a tangible cost.
It is. And certain things are hit harder. Shoes, apparently 15% more expensive. Apparel, 14% higher. Motor vehicles could see a 9.3% rise in the short run. That could add maybe $3,000 to the price of an average new car.
$3,000 extra on a car.
Yeah. And even food prices are up around 2.3% due to these effects.
So it's hitting everyday items, things people buy regularly. Now, a critical question the sources raise. Who actually pays for these tariffs? Does it hit everyone equally?
That's a really important point. The sources emphasize that tariffs tend to function as a regressive tax,
Regressive meaning.
meaning they disproportionately burden households at the lower end of the income distribution more than those at the top, especially when you measure it as a share of their income, particularly in the short run. One source calculated the burden on the second lowest income decile is 2.5 times that of the top decile.
2.5 times more impact on lower-income families. That's significant. It's not an evenly spread cost at all.
Not according to this analysis, no.
Okay, what about the big picture? The overall economy? GDP, jobs.
Looking at GDP and employment effects, the combined impact of all these 2025 U.S. tariffs and the foreign retaliation, it's projected to lower U.S. real GDP growth by about 0.7 percentage points over the calendar year 2025.
Slowing down growth.
Yes. And in the longer run, the estimate is the U.S. economy could be persistently about 0.4% smaller. That translates to an annual loss of roughly $110 billion in 2024 dollars.
$110 billion a year and jobs.
The unemployment rate is expected to tick up maybe by 0.4 percentage points by the end of 2025. That could mean about 456,000 fewer payroll jobs than we might otherwise have had. Clear economic headwinds.
So lower growth, fewer jobs overall. Are there any shifts within the economy, like some sectors doing better while others suffer?
Yes, there's what economists call sectoral reallocation. While the total economy might shrink a bit, the manufacturing sector is actually projected to expand, maybe by 1.5% to 2.5% in the long run, because of the protection from imports.
So manufacturing grows. That sounds like a positive goal of the policy, maybe.
It might be an intended outcome for some. However, the sources suggest this growth kind of crowds out other important sectors. Construction, for example, is projected to contract by about 3.1%. Agriculture by 1.1%, mining and extraction also by 1.1%. And interestingly, one estimate suggests that even within manufacturing, these tariffs could ultimately reduce manufacturing employment by perhaps 500,000 jobs in the long run, maybe due to higher input costs or retaliatory tariffs hitting exports.
Wow, so even the sector meant to benefit might see job losses. It's a really complex picture of trade-offs.
Very complex. Winners and losers, but maybe more losers overall, according to these projections.
Okay, with all these pretty significant impacts we've just discussed, you might be wondering, didn't the U.S. and China just reach some kind of new trade deal in May 2025? It made a lot of headlines.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, a bit confusing based on the sources. On May 12, 2025, yes, the U.S. and China did announce an agreement, and it involved reducing those specific reciprocal tariff rates we mentioned earlier, the ones that had spiked up to 125 or 145%.
Okay, so what did they agree to?
The U.S. reduced its rate on those specific goods back down to 10%. China made a similar reduction. This was effective May 14, 2025, for an initial 90-day period.
90 days. Okay, so it sounded like a clear step back, a de-escalation.
That's certainly how it was framed by some. However, there's a really notable disconnect in how each side characterized this agreement.
A disconnect? How so?
The U.S. side, particularly the Trump administration, really framed it as a China trade deal, a substantial step forward, kind of implying a clear win, maybe even a finalized agreement. In fact, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick reportedly confirmed that despite this specific reduction, the overall average tariff rate on China, that 51% number, would remain largely unchanged because of all the other stacked tariffs still in place.
Ah, so the U.S. presented it as a deal, but maybe not one that changed the big picture much. How did China see it?
Well, China's perspective, according to the reports, was far more reserved. Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng apparently didn't refer to it as a finalized agreement at all.
Not an agreement. What did he call it?
He described it as establishing a consultation mechanism, basically an agreement to keep talking. And he framed it as moving forward with their Geneva Consensus.
Geneva Consensus, what does that mean?
The sources suggest this refers to a broader framework for ongoing multilateral trade talks. It emphasizes commitment to dialogue rather than signaling a specific, concrete, legally binding deal with immediate, broad tariff rollbacks.
So the U.S. says deal, China says let's keep talking. That's a pretty fundamental difference in interpretation.
It is, and it creates significant uncertainty.
So what does this mean for businesses trying to navigate this, and for you, listening, trying to understand what's next?
Well, that uncertainty is the core issue right now. If you're a business relying on international trade, you might hesitate. Do you invest? Do you hire? Or do you just pass potentially higher costs on to consumers because you can't be sure if those reciprocal tariffs might just snap back up after the 90 days?
Because there's no actual long-term certainty provided by this mechanism.
Exactly. Crucially, the sources point out there is still no published terms for this agreement. No schedules for further tariff cuts, and no clear agreements reported on the really core issues that started this whole thing, like intellectual property protection, state subsidies for Chinese companies.
The fundamental disagreements are still there.
They seem to be. So this May agreement, as the sources suggest, might be more of a political signal than an economic shift, at least for now. More about optics than substance, perhaps.
Okay. We've really covered a lot of ground here. We've navigated the tangled layers of U.S.-China tariffs, the stacked duties. We've explored China's strategic responses that drive to reduce dependence, especially on things like soybeans, examined the real, tangible economic costs, the higher prices, the regressive impact, the effects on GDP and jobs, and highlighted this really fascinating disconnect in how the recent quote-unquote deal is being interpreted by both sides. So as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's something to think about. Consider how these complex, often ambiguous agreements really highlight the ongoing strategic competition between these global powers. Beyond the immediate tariff numbers, beyond the headlines about a deal, think about China's long-term push for self-sufficiency. In critical areas like food, like rare earths, how might that long-term strategic drive fundamentally reshape global trade, reshape supply chains for decades to come, long after any single temporary tariff is gone? It's definitely something for all of us to keep mulling over as this global economic landscape continues to shift.